All right, we're back, and we're continuing our tour of Nazi aggression in the 1930s, which we will unduly speed up because there's just so much going on. Hitler comes to power, and as I said, what's important to remember is that what he's doing isn't extreme in the context of European politics. Later on, we'll have this massive Holocaust and this attempt to take all of Europe and invasions of all these neighboring countries, but that's not a reality yet. No one's aware of that yet. Clearly, he alarms, especially the French and the Russians, Stalin, but otherwise, he doesn't seem that extreme. In Europe, in Germany, Hitler is actually responsible for an economic revival. He creates kind of a corporative state, kind of like Mussolini did, where the government and businesses work very closely together. They build major public works programs like the Autobahn. Actually, Volkswagen, the people's car, right, comes into creation, I believe, at this time. So the West sees this guy who's a strong man, to be sure, rough, to be sure, but who's creating an economic revival, who hates the communists, which is good by them. He doesn't like the Jews, but again, that's not terribly surprising. In any of the major powers' ruling classes, anti-Semitism is going to be rampant. So Hitler's moves then are met with concern, to be sure, but not with alarm. He leaves a conference on disarmament. He announces this program of Anschluss, of uniting Germans. He supports the Austrian Nazis who, like the Germans, beat up and attack and use paramilitary tactics against socialists, against trade unionists. They assassinate political opponents. They attack Jews. All of that, is undeniable. He begins a program of rearmament in 1935. He begins a program of conscription. Germany begins a military draft in 1935 to increase the size of its army. So clearly he is doing things that concern the rest of the world. The other Europeans get together, including the Italians. The Italians and Germans are not on the same side yet. Italy, in fact, thinks that it can be a broker between Germany and on one side and then the other countries, the British and the French on the other. So they meet and they say, what are we going to do about Germany? And basically, they decide that, they will, try to talk to Hitler, do what they can, but no one's willing to make a strong stand against the Nazis, all right? So this is a policy which will be known as appeasement, okay? And you've heard that term before, and it's kind of a this is why. There we go. It's kind of a misunderstood and really, become a very derogatory term. But what's it mean? Appeasement. I mean, generally we get the idea that it means, you give them whatever they want. You let them do whatever they want. That's not what it means. It's actually kind of a global strategy. Well, no, it's more than that. Appeasement basically is a recognition that what's happening fits within certain standards. It fits within certain contexts. And we will try. It doesn't mean you don't try to stop anything. It means we will try to change this. We will stand against it. We will speak against it. But we don't think that it's in our interest as well as in global interest to actually make a huge stand against that. It recognizes that there may be legitimate reasons for a particular behavior. All right? In this case, it's hard to deny that the Versailles Settlement really was crazy, that it really did damage German interests. Versailles put limits on Germany that no other country had. So when Hitler says, I'm going to rearm, it's really hard to say, well, we're going to, use force to prevent you from rearming. Okay? It recognizes, as I said before, that what Germany is doing is not terribly unusual in terms of European power politics. That his approach toward the communist is actually one which the other powers appreciate. He's anti-communist. That's good. Stalin is a far graver threat to them than Hitler is in the early 1930s. It recognizes that in all of the countries that had fought in World War I, there was a general revulsion against war. In Britain, in France, the memory of World War I and the grave sites especially were still, very fresh. So Do you want to do that again? Do you want to have another major global war just, a decade or so after this first one? In the United States, you don't have the same kind of carnage, but the imagery and the memory of World War I is still very strong. In the early 30s, there was actually a Senate committee called the Nye Committee, which concluded that World War I in the United States, American intervention in World War I, was caused by arms makers and war profiteers, that they had kind of used their influence to convince Wilson to go to war. So there was this sense that World War I was a mistake in the United States. So in the U.S., this sense of isolationism grows. So the idea of appeasement, now we think, God, they should have stopped Hitler when they could have. And, it would be hard not to. How could you not agree with that? But in 1934, 1935, 1936, it would have been a major step to say, we need to take forceful action now to stop this guy. Because what he's doing doesn't seem that irrational, doesn't seem that unusual, certainly isn't ahistorical, and nobody, senses what the larger ramifications of it are going to be, all right? So this policy of appeasement, then, is prevalent in the West, which means, yeah, we're going to remain concerned, we're going to monitor this, we're going to do what we can, but we are not going to take forceful action because the behavior does not seem to be a grave threat, it doesn't seem to be extreme, it doesn't seem to be out of the ordinary, it doesn't seem to be irrational at this particular time. Now, Mussolini, once he sees this, and both Hitler and Mussolini will think the same thing, they're not going to do anything. So Mussolini sees this appeasement of Hitler, and this is when you get the Italian intervention into Ethiopia, into Abyssinia. And what's really striking about that, and Hitler notices, is no one does anything to stop him. The League of Nations, basically, this is when you get the slap on the wrist. They'll pass a resolution that says Italy is wrong, Italy should be condemned. But there's no effective action taken to force Italy to leave Ethiopia. Ethiopia is it's really a carnage. You literally have a cavalry on horseback, men carrying spears against the Italians who have airplanes with mustard gas. So, this is the kind of warfare that's being exhibited here, but the League of Nations will not impose sanctions against Italy, and it will not consider an oil embargo against Italy. And if you really want to hurt a country in warfare, you got to do that kind of stuff. You got to say, there's an embargo, you can't get supplies, there's sanctions against you, you got to take measures. The League of Nations refuses to do that, all right? That's appeasement. In retrospect, no one could disagree. That was wrong. It was stupid. It was counterproductive. It led to the emergence of Hitler and Mussolini in global war. We all know that in 2004. But in 1935, 1936, 1937, you couldn't anticipate that. You might have, and you would have been right, and some people did. Stalin clearly was. But it would have, it's not as unusual in the 30s. Now, that's not to say appeasement should be condemned. It should be. It leads to the emergence of this horrible war. And in retrospect, we should say, yeah, they should have taken a stronger line. All right. So Germany sees that they're not going to do anything. So in March of 1936, the Germans go back into the Rhineland. The Rhine area borders Germany and France. And during World War, as a result of Versailles, it was demilitarized. Does the cursor come up here? Yeah, sort of comes up. But you can kind of see the Rhine. There's the Rhine River, the Rhineland there. I don't know if that's showing up or not. Yeah, it is. Cool. The Rhineland was demilitarized. Basically, at Versailles, they said that the Germans could have no military forces in the Rhine. All right. But in 1936, Hitler goes back in. What do the French do? Nothing. Hitler had given his commanders orders, if the French respond with force, if they move their forces into the Rhine, we will retreat. All right? But the French didn't do that. And basically the French thought was, it's German. The Rhine is in Germany. So, it's kind of hard to take that away. And plus, the people of Europe, the people of France don't want another war against Germany. And they're also building, we'll talk about this later, they're building this massive line of fortresses, which is going to protect them, called the Maginot Line. So the French think, we're not happy about this, the guy's crazy, we have to be careful about it, but nonetheless, we will continue this policy of appeasement, even if, and again, if the French had responded, Hitler had given orders to his commanders to retreat, but they didn't, all right? Now, the movement to the Rhineland means that Germany is not nearly as vulnerable to the French coming in as they had been before, so it's very important, okay? So, let's... to go back to the outline so I know what I'm talking about. That's always kind of questionable, right? So Germany goes into the Rhineland. After that, German attention shifts toward Czechoslovakia. So I guess, actually, I should keep that map up, huh? Was that it? Oh, yeah. All right, Czechoslovakia, especially the northern part of Czechoslovakia here is an area called the Sudeten region, the Sudetenland. And the Sudeten region was heavily populated by ethnic Germans. And Hitler believed that legitimately should belong. I'm sorry, wait a minute. Let me go back a bit. Before that, even in 1936, Hitler actually goes into Austria as part of the Anschluss and takes control there. So 1936, the first victim is actually Austria. And Nazi troops cross into Austria. There's no opposition. You actually have women and children throwing flowers at the Nazi soldiers as they move in to Austria. That's the first victim in the Anschluss. All right. After that, Hitler looks at the Sudeten region, which is ethnically German. In 1936, Hitler says to the British and to the French, the Sudetenland should be ours. It is ethnically German, and so the British and the French think about it, and they say, okay, I tell you what, if you agree to refrain from military action after this, we will acquiesce in this seizure of the Sudetenland. And so Hitler does it, and the British and the French go along. As a result of that, in 1938, the British and the French meet with Hitler in Munich, the famous Munich conference. At Munich, Hitler says, okay, I'm done. Really, I've gotten all I need, and it's only fair. Austria and the Sudeten region are ethnically German anyway. I'm done. And so the British and the French say, okay, and they come to an agreement. A lot more than that goes on. I'm going quickly through it. And Neville Chamberlain, who's the British Prime Minister, arrives back in London, and he says, this conference means that there will be peace in our time, right? They postponed this clash. So Hitler has promised not to continue this aggression. However, what happens? Hitler goes not only after the Sudetenland, but takes all of Czechoslovakia. And what's ironic about Munich, and this is just a month after Munich, at Munich, who was not there? Who was not represented? Czechoslovakia. So even though the Sudeten was part of Czechoslovakia, the Czechs themselves were not represented officially at Munich. So all these other countries get together to decide the fate of Czechoslovakia. So Munich was obviously a major failure, by late 38, early 39, all of Czechoslovakia is now in German hands. So you have Austria, the Sudeten, and now all of Czechoslovakia. At this point, the West finally gets it. In Britain, in France, there's a real recognition that this guy's not going to stop. So you start to see these countries kind of ramp up their military budgets and start to take far more active roles in the conflict against the Nazis. In Britain, there's an election, and Chamberlain is defeated, and Churchill takes over. At the same time this is going on, there's kind of a prologue to the war nearby in Spain. And again, I'll go through this quickly. In Spain, there had been an elected government. You call it the Republican government, the Republic. All right? The Republic comes under attack in 1936 from a group called the Phalangists. The Phalangists are essentially fascists. They were like Nazis. And they were led by General Francisco Franco. Franco and the Phalangists decide to attack the government. Why? The government is too secular, it's too far to the left, it's anarchist, it's communist, all the stuff that's being said about it. Who supports Franco? The military and the Catholic Church. Franco's biggest supporters are the military and the Catholic Church. So Franco begins this civil war. Now, in 1933, when Hitler took over, Stalin began to complain about Hitler. So when the Republic, when the government, the official government of Spain says, we need help, who comes to their aid? Do the French? No. Do the British? Do the Americans? Does the Soviet Union? Yeah. Soviet Union fights for the Republic. Who fights with Franco? Who gives Franco support? Germany and Italy. And in fact, for the Germans, this was an attempt, a chance for them to try their new air force, their Luftwaffe. All right? And so what happens in the Spanish Civil War? It's brutal. It's ugly. Oh, I forgot I was going to find a picture of Guernica. But this is where, if you've ever seen Goya's famous picture of Guernica, these are actually air attacks on villages. So it's very brutal, it's very bloody. And in 1939, the Republic falls and Franco wins. So this is kind of like a test run for World War II. It's a prologue to it. In Spain, the Western powers refuse to support the government. The Soviet Union does support the government, clearly for its own agenda. Franco is supported by the Germans and the French, and they win. And again, this is kind of what if, which I generally don't do and don't think a whole lot of. But clearly, I mean, had Germany been stopped, or had the Franco been stopped, or had the West stood forcefully against this fascist aggression, then, you know, clearly it would have given Hitler pause to think about what was going on. But that didn't happen. So again, this policy of appeasement becomes really problematic. All right? With all of this going on, Hitler sees nobody willing to take any actions that will stop him. So after the invasion of all of Czechoslovakia in early 1939, the other European powers say, okay, we're going to stand against this guy. The British and Poles make a pact, a mutual defense pact, but that doesn't matter. On September 1st, 1939, what does Hitler do? He invades Poland. And this is more or less the official start of World War II. The invasion of Poland is very dramatic and rapid. Hitler unleashes a new type of war. I should have put that up there. This was kind of a repudiation of the trench warfare of World War I. Hitler unleashes something called Blitzkrieg War. Blitzkrieg, kind of meaning lightning war. The invasion of Poland is unlike anything that anybody had ever seen. Remember World War I, you dig trenches, you bombard the other side, then you get up and you attack, and then you get blown back, and they come, and it's just this carnage. They're not going to do that again. So Blitzkrieg means you send everything, lightning, you send infantry, you send artillery, you send air support, you send armor. And the Germans just come flooding into Poland, and Poland's cavalry is on horseback, so it really is modernity versus kind of antiquity in that regard. And the Germans blow through Poland, and within weeks, Poland falls. Germany, because of the agreement, Britain declares war on Germany at that time, but it doesn't come into Poland or do anything like that. Poland falls. Yeah. Oh, but they do actually. Actually, the point of it was that the military and military spending was a way to revitalize the German economy. So by making these agreements with private companies to build airplanes, to build up tanks and weapons and things like that, this creates jobs, it creates economic opportunity. That's where the economic revival comes from, specifically.
I mean, Germany itself doesn't have any money to build all this, right? Like,
sure.
Oh, it does?
Sure. I mean, the state pays for it. The state and corporations pay for it. So yeah, I mean, Germany wasn't broke. Germany couldn't pay its external debts. You know, but Germany is producing goods. I mean, it's a major industrial power. They have raw material. I mean, the point of National Socialism is to live within your borders. I mean, Germany doesn't need a whole lot from outside. It has the capacity. And the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia, which I failed to mention, which is really important, is resource rich. So what Germany does, it has the Ruhr and the Saar Valley, it has the means within its own borders to maintain a very powerful industrial economy. And it uses this to build this major military force. It starts a draft. So if you have a problem with unemployment, what's one way to address unemployment? Put a bunch of people in the army, right? Give them jobs, give them pay. They use the money, they buy consumer goods. So it really is part. You build the Autobahn, you build the automobile industry up, you know, BASF and Benz and all these companies we know about today. We're Nazi supporters. So yeah, I mean, it's an economic and a military policy all in one.
At that time, Lufthansa had more routes than any airline in the world.
Oh, really?
Huh.
Oh, really? I didn't know that. That's cool. It's not cool, but you know, I didn't know that. So no, I mean, that was part of the Hitler economic miracle. It was essentially what the U.S. is going to do when World War II breaks out. It's military Keynesianism. It's using government money to build up a massive military establishment, and it also creates an economic revival. So, yeah. So yeah, he clearly did have the capacity to do that because of it. I mean, this is where the German economic revival comes from. So 1939 then, when he goes into Poland, I mean, it's just a walkover. And there had been, prior to that time, a window of opportunity. By 1939, the Germans clearly have military superiority. They have a massive army, a Wehrmacht, they have technology, they have weapons, and they have this big air force, the Luftwaffe. Prior to that time, there had been, and this is a brief window of opportunity that the Germans have. Prior to that time, the West still had superiority, at least in numbers and in terms of weapons and things like that. The military experts said, well, you know, the British and the French and the Americans, and that's another story, but the British and the French could contain Germany. They have the means to do it. But there's a brief period in late 38 and 1939 where the Germans actually overtake the enemy, right? And this is when they go into Czechoslovakia and when they go into Poland. Now, the real fear there is that once the other countries, and if the U.S. does it, game over, once these other countries ramp up their industrial economies to provide the sinews of war, then we're in trouble. So we got to hit them quick and get this over with fast while we have an advantage. So Germany takes advantage. They exploit this window of opportunity, which they have in 39. Right? They know it's not going to last long. And you know, once American industry kicks in, the level of production is going to just blow away anybody else. And the Germans want to avoid that. Their goal, and the goal in all of these wars, the Japanese try to do it, the Germans hope to do it, the Vietnamese, Ho Chi Minh hopes to do it, is to keep the U.S. out of the war. Not necessarily because the Americans are the greatest fighters in the world and all that other kind of hooey stuff. It's basically because American factories can produce more weapons than anybody else by far. That's the major thing, all right? I mean, this is the hole I'm digging here, but the kind of whole greatest generation World War II thing. The story of World War II wasn't the American soldier in Europe, because World War II in Europe was won by the Red Army. The story of American intervention in World War II was what American factory workers did. It's Rosie the Riveter and the guy at the line who made these things, right? That's what won World War II. That's really what blew the Germans out of the water. The American contribution was far more industrial than anything else, all right? You know, the actual bodies were European, especially Russian, which the new records indicate. Russia lost 50 million people, you know, in the war. So, I mean, but America's industrial output was decisive, and that's really 50 million, which is about approximately a third of the entire country. That's civilian and military both, probably more civilian, in fact. Anyway, so the invasion of Poland, oh yeah.
So if Germany and Russia were naturally at odds with each other, what was up with their secret?
Well, we'll talk about that. That's important too. That's a major development because, you know, that's a good point. And one thing I should have said at the beginning, I'm not doing this chronologically because that would be a mess. If you try to do World War II chronologically, you're all over the place. Basically, it's thematically, geographically is the best way to do this. So that's why I haven't talked about that yet, but I will go back. And that's important because 9 days before Germany invades Poland, it cuts a deal with the Soviet Union. So even though Stalin had spent all this time saying, what about Hitler, what about Hitler, what about Hitler, he basically says, better to join him than to fight him because no one else is going to help me out. So yeah, they cut a deal. So I will get to that though, all right? But now I want to talk a little bit about U.S. policy in the 1930s, all right? And again, try to do this quickly, which is not going. Okay. Yeah, I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, and you know, this stuff's all really easy. Any book on World War II or any textbook is going to cover this. You know, so, if you really want to find out more about it, it's pretty easy to come up with. In the 1930s, U.S. policy was considered isolationist. Isolationism being a long American tradition from George Washington's farewell address on. Basically means stay out of the conflicts, the squabbles of other countries. As a result of this, the United States in the 30s actually had laws passed which said you have to be neutral. You cannot take action in global conflicts. Now, what was the point? What was the basis for this isolation, for this neutrality? Why do you think Americans went that direction in the 30s? Yeah, but even more than that. What had just happened 15 years earlier? First World War. First World War, how did the U.S. get involved in the war? It was shipping goods. It was not neutral. Ships were being sunk. Submarines were attacking the Lusitania. So the image of World War I is very bad. After World War I, you have this disillusionment. What happened at Versailles? Versailles was a mess. Germany was devastated. As a result of that, Hitler emerges. The U.S. doesn't even join the League of Nations. And then the Nye Commission comes out and says, well, it was all because of war profiteering. So by the 30s, the Americans, people are saying, whoa, this is ridiculous. So there is a strong isolationist movement. And in fact, there's even a major group of people called the America First Committee, big organization, which has as its goal to keep the U.S. out of war. The America First Committee. Anybody know who its national spokesman is? Charles Lindbergh. You know who Charles Lindbergh is, right? Famous guy. First guy to... Yeah, he's first got across the Atlantic, right? So Lindbergh's famous American. He's a really well-known guy at the time. The America First Committee is very popular. And most Americans say, we don't want to fight. I mean, look what World War I did. It was a disaster. Nothing good came of that. We don't want to do that. Again, as a result of that, of this need to stay at home, Congress passes neutrality laws which say that we can't sell weapons to countries that are at war. Two reasons the U.S. did not support the Spanish Republic. One was neutrality laws. Even though it was a civil war, even though Franco was illegally attacking the government, neutrality laws said you can't support the government. Secondly, what was another reason? Who do you think in the U.S. would have put pressure on FDR not to support the Spanish Republic? The Catholic Church. The American Catholic Church put heavy pressure on FDR as well because they supported Franco, just as they supported Mussolini, just as they didn't really do anything while Hitler was killing Jews. There's a book out a couple years ago called Hitler's Pope about, was it Pius XII? No, it wasn't the 12th, which I forget. Pope Pius, one of them. Got a bunch of X's and 1's after his name. Somewhere there's a nun turning over because I don't know this, right? The Catholic Church was one of the biggest sponsors of fascism, was the biggest sponsor of fascism among European institutions, along with the industrialists. So Roosevelt doesn't do anything. He has these neutrality laws. He has anti-communism. And again, this idea that Hitler's an anti-communist is very powerful, right? I mean, Polish Americans, for instance, before 1939, fear Stalin more than they do Hitler. They fear communism. So, I mean, there's this general sense that Hitler, we got to keep our eye on him, but, so isolationism is very, very powerful. Now, Roosevelt also understands what had happened in World War I. He doesn't want to see the Germans close the door. I mean, keep that in mind. Hitler's ultimate goal of taking over Central Europe, of creating this greater Germany, would close the door to an incredibly vital area. And the U.S. doesn't want to see this. Roosevelt clearly doesn't want to see this. So on one hand, he doesn't want to get involved in a war because he's quite aware of World War I and he knows the American people aren't behind this. And what is Roosevelt dealing with at home? Which, more important than anything else, the Great Depression, right? So I mean, that's by far his number one priority. So this war in Europe is certainly peripheral compared to the other problems he faces. So he has these neutrality laws, but at the same time, he doesn't want to see Germany get too powerful. So at one point, Congress passes a law called cash and carry. I didn't put it on there. It's kind of as it sounds, cash and carry. Basically, what this said was that if the British wanted to buy supplies from the U.S. that they could use in the war, they would have to send their ships to American ports, pick it up, pay in cash, meaning hard currency, and carry it back themselves. Why would Roosevelt do that? What was he thinking about? World War I, right? Because in World War I, what happened? These German subs kept sinking American ships. So now we're going to avoid that. The British are going to have to pay in cash and carry it back themselves. Neutrality laws. In fact, in 1938, Congress, I think by a vote or two, voted down, almost passed a resolution called the Ludlow Amendment, which would have said that any time the U.S. was going to go to war, that there would have to be a national vote on it. That before you could go to war, people would have to actually go out and vote on it, right? And that almost passed just by a few votes, probably more than one or two, but it was a close call. So Roosevelt, clearly is of two minds. On one mind, the Nazi threat is great, and it will become greater over time, not because they're bad to the Poles or because they're killing Jews, it's because they threaten to close the door, right? At the same time, Roosevelt has these neutrality laws. He has strong isolationist sentiment against them, so he has to reappraise policy. In Europe, he has the attack on Poland to contend with, this German aggression, which for a time slows down. After Germany attacks Poland in September of 1939, nothing happens for about 7 or 8 months. This was referred to as Sitzkrieg, or sitting war. In the West, they call this the Phony War. And once again, after attacking Poland, Hitler said, I'm done, That's it, It's kind of like the scene from The Producers. I don't know if you've ever seen that, with Hitler, I'm a man of peace, a piece of Poland, a piece of Austria, a piece of Czechoslovakia, that kind of thing. And again, that gives Roosevelt some breathing room. So on one hand, you have cash and carry, you have this recognition that stuff's going on and we have to be aware of it. On the other hand, you don't want to do too much. You don't want to do too much. Roosevelt, however, decides that short of getting involved in the war with American troops, which there's no way you can do that in the 30s, the U.S. will take a role, and the U.S. will take a role using its major advantage, which, what did I say it was a couple minutes ago? Industry, right? The United States will become, Roosevelt says, the arsenal of democracy. The arsenal of democracy. What's that mean? What's the U.S. going to do? We're going to build guns and tanks and weapons and ammunition and boats, and we're going to ship them to people who are fighting against Hitler. We won't fight, but we will be an arsenal for those. All right, that's going to be the major accomplishment, the major role that the U.S. plays. All right. In addition to that, Roosevelt also begins to send naval convoys to protect British merchant ships in the North Atlantic. So you start to take more action. In 1940, Roosevelt completed a deal. I don't think I put any of this on here, which is fine. I'm going through it quickly. In 1940, Roosevelt completed a deal with the British called Destroyers for Bases. He gave the British 50 old destroyers and in return got some really valuable bases for it. All right. In 1940, Roosevelt got Congress to pass a selective service law. What's selective service? You draft. It's a conscription law, right? So he's preparing for war. Roosevelt says, he's slick, he's a great politician. Roosevelt and Bill Clinton are the two best politicians I've ever seen. Roosevelt says, I need conscription as a way to keep America out of the war, because once the Germans see that we're serious, they'll back down, right? I mean, he's slick. Wendell Willkie, who was running against Roosevelt, was furious. He said, the selective service, I mean, that's ridiculous. You don't have a draft to stay out of the war. There's a great cartoon back when they reinstituted conscription in 1980, and it's a bunch of cows lining up, and they said, yeah, they're just taking our names so they know who we are as they march into the butcher house, right? So Wendell Willkie, this is Wendell Willkie's point, and Wendell Willkie says, that's ridiculous. A draft means you're ready to go to war, and Roosevelt gives a famous speech where he says, I'm not going to send, what did he say, to the mothers of America, your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars. And he's weeping as he says this, and everyone says, oh, it's kind of like Roosevelt, Wilson in 1916, right? Wendell Willkie says, that hypocritical son of a bitch, this is going to beat me. And Roosevelt did win the election easily, and in fact, that was right. So he he wins the election in 1940 after promising, I won't go to war. And what does he do? He begins to escalate American involvement, the arsenal of democracy. In 1941, probably the most important legislation was called the Lend-Lease Act. Lend-Lease, and again, this is a response to what had happened in World War I. Remember in World War I, the U.S. made all these loans and sold all these goods to the British, and the French never got paid for it, right? Because everybody was broke. We're not going to do that this time. Roosevelt's slick. He says, we're not going to sell them stuff that we don't get paid for. We're going to lend it to them. And when you lend something, when you loan somebody something, what does that mean? You got to get it back, right? So Roosevelt says, it's like if your house is on fire, your neighbor's house is on fire. He comes over, you give him a garden hose to put it out. You don't negotiate or quibble, you deal with it later. But there's an emergency. Europe is on fire. We have to give them garden hoses. One senator said it's more like loaning somebody a piece of bubble gum. You don't want it back after they chew it. One other senator, Burton Wheeler from Montana, was more strident. He compared it to Roosevelt's. If any of you studied the New Deal, the Agricultural Adjustment Act and the New Deal actually paid farmers to not grow things, and as a result of that, they actually were paid to dump milk out or slaughter animals and bury them to take goods off of the market to keep prices high. So Burton Wheeler from Montana said that the Lend-Lease Act is like it's the New Deal's Agricultural Adjustment Act for foreign policy. It will plow under every fourth American boy. Pretty sharp. Why did he say that? What did the Lend-Lease Act do? It said we will give goods to people fighting against Hitler. We will loan them goods, right? Now, what Wheeler and other critics were saying is if you do this, you are getting involved in the war. You are becoming a combatant against Hitler. If Hitler's soldiers are being killed, whether it be by British or French or whoever, with American guns, being supplied by American ships, then you clearly are becoming a combatant in the war, right? Nonetheless, it's a risk Roosevelt is willing to take. What else is important about Lend-Lease, which doesn't get as much play, which is really vitally important, is Lend-Lease is an agreement. You can go read it on the internet. Article 7 of the Lend-Lease Act is really the guts of the Lend-Lease agreement. What does it say? It's a bunch of legalese I'll read to you. I'll highlight the important part. In the final determination of the benefits to be provided to the United States of America by the government of the United Kingdom in return for aid furnished under this Act of Congress of March 11, 1941, the terms of conditions thereof shall be such as not to burden commerce between the two countries, but to promote mutually advantageous economic relations between them and the betterment of worldwide economic relations. Now this is important. This is a bill to supply war materiel to Germany. But what are they talking about? They're talking about economic relations. You can kind of see where this is headed. To that end, they shall include provision for agreed action by the United States of America and the United Kingdom, open to participation by all of the countries of like mind, directed to the expansion by appropriate international and domestic measures of production, employment, and the exchange and consumption of goods, which are the material foundations of the liberty and welfare of all peoples. What is democracy? Commercial liberty, right? To the elimination, this is it, to the elimination of all forms of discriminatory treatment in international commerce and the reduction of tariffs and other trade barriers, repeat, to the elimination of all forms of discriminatory treatment in international commerce and to the reduction of tariffs and other trade barriers. What kind of discriminatory treatment would they be talking about if they're talking to the British? The imperial preference system. Roosevelt uses Lend-Lease to break open British markets. All right? That's kind of the guts of this thing. Sure, it's a way, but what's the real motivation? Do you see anything in here about Hitler's treatment of the Jews? About the horrible attack on Poland? About the Sudeten invasion? About Czechoslovakia? About the Anschluss? About Nazi attacks on Jews in Germany? You don't see any of that, do you? What's it talking about? Commercial liberty. Okay, to the elimination of all forms of discriminatory treatment in international commerce, the reduction of tariffs and other trade barriers, and in general to the attainment of all the economic objectives set forth in the joint declaration made on August 14th by the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. All right? This is critical. Lend-Lease becomes one of the first steps in America's ultimate goal, which is to use global conflict as a way to promote a global, 2 words, 4 letters each, open door. All right? That's really, 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 important. This is what ultimately this comes down to. All right? So the United States uses this then. Now what's happening in Europe? What's going on in Europe at the time? After the attack on Poland, you have a brief period where nothing happens. It's called the Phony War. But then what happens? What happens in the spring of 1940? What does Hitler do? He invades France. Now, France was supposed to be impregnable, right? They couldn't invade France because, and I think I have a map later on that I'll show you. France has built this incredible system of fortifications called the Maginot Line. But the Germans go around it. Instead of going through it, they go around it, right? And so France is invaded in May of 1940. And what happens? 6 weeks, barely 6 weeks later, France falls. Germany invades, wins, occupies France. Now, to the west, this is staggering because France was considered a major barrier, right? France has fallen. Hitler sets up a dummy government at Vichy. So France is basically under German control. And this is staggering. It could have been worse. There was a major evacuation at the Channel, a place called Dunkirk. But at one point, I mean, Hitler had, I mean, the Germans, the Wehrmacht had, I forget, like, I think a couple 100,000 French soldiers basically trapped, and they were able to escape. The British had created this incredible flotilla where everybody, I mean, fishermen and Navy boats and yachts and everybody heads into Dunkirk, and they evacuate these French, and the French actually set up kind of an exile army under the leadership of you know, the big guy with the funny nose. Looked like De Gaulle, yeah, LBJ, right? So this is a major catastrophe. And at that point, what does Hitler do? Like, wow, he's captured France. What's left? What's left? Britain. Okay, this begins the Battle of Britain. This begins in the summer of 1940. And what's the Battle of Britain? How's the Battle of Britain going to be waged? By air. This is going to be the first attempt, really, in modern warfare to subdue a country exclusively by air. There is a cross-channel invasion plan, but first the goal is to wipe out the British. The attacks begin in July and then seriously in August, and this, you know, really is, no one has seen air war like this before. Hitler had bragged that the Luftwaffe was the greatest air force ever created and it would destroy Britain. However, that doesn't happen. The British Royal Air Force, the RAF, which was bolstered by the development of radar systems by British scientists, actually stood its ground, but it was really a destructive war. In August and September of 1940, the RAF, the British, had over 800 fighters destroyed and over 500 damaged. The Luftwaffe had over 600 fighters destroyed and 400 damaged, but also lost 500 bombers. So you can see in a very short period of time what a staggering war this began. The Germans initially began by attacking military installations. In Phase 2, they begin to go after fighter command bases. In Phase 3, which is in September, they begin terror war. They begin to attack London and other major cities. The idea there, which is part of the theory of air war, is you attack the people. You attack innocent civilians, and what do? What will they do? They'll weaken and they will demand surrender. They will demand that their leaders surrender in order to stop this, all right? That's the theory behind terror air war. Does it work? No. You all know the Battle of Britain. There's movies and books and everything about it. So by late 1940, the Royal Air Force stops Germany. This is the first time Hitler has been stopped. So this is, finally a major relief. It's the first good news that's come out of this thing in years. In addition to that, in 1940, the Americans and British begin to cooperate in these operations in the Atlantic. This is the so-called Undeclared War in the Atlantic, where the Americans and begin to use convoys, and they actually start shooting at the Germans in October and in October of 1941, just before Pearl Harbor, a little bit before Pearl Harbor, 2 American ships, the Kearney and the Reuben James, were actually attacked by German submarines and sunk. In the case of the Reuben James, 100 and some people died on it. Roosevelt at that time said something to the effect of, with regard to the with the convoys, the Americans are shooting on the Germans, he said, if they do it again, we're going to do it like the Japs do. This is Roosevelt talking. We'll say so sorry, and then we'll hit them again, and we'll sink too. So Roosevelt, and the point I'm trying to make here is that before Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt is gearing up for war. a lot of people will have this kind of conspiracy theory that Pearl Harbor was a setup. It's kind of like the 9/11 theories, right? Roosevelt knew that the Japanese were going to attack Pearl Harbor, and he let them do it because he needed to get into the war. It was a backdoor to war. It's kind of like these people who say, they knew that 9/11 was going to happen, and the CIA did it as an excuse to go to war against Afghanistan and Iraq, right? Neither has any validity. There's no proof of either. And it also, on one level, implies a level of competence that just isn't there either. So, you really think the CIA, you have guys who go in for flying lessons and say, I don't want to learn how to take off or land, just how to fly, and that doesn't even ring a bell. You think they're competent enough to blow up a couple buildings in New York? Good Lord, if the CIA had run that operation, they would have been hitting like Des Moines and, Peoria instead of, the World Trade Center, so. Man.
Did the CIA director recently resign?
Yeah.
For what reason?
The intelligence was dreadful. And basically, he took a sword for Bush. I mean, we'll talk about that, actually. And to some extent, well, not really to the extent Pearl Harbor. Basically, when 9/11 happened, the general line was, this is the worst intelligence disaster since Pearl Harbor, right? The idea, intelligence is political. You basically tell them what they want to hear, all right? And Pearl Harbor was dreadful. They were incompetent. They missed signals all over the place. No one could believe that Japan would do that, right? So basically, it's bad intelligence, but it's also intelligence that's very politically oriented. You don't go in, and say, you're all wrong, this is what's happening, right? I mean, two people, actually, with regard to 911, there were two agents, one in Minnesota, the other one, I think, in Arizona, who said, something's going on here. We really need to investigate these guys who are taking flying lessons and not asking, how to take off or land. And they got in trouble for it, basically because they rocked the boat. I think they were both women, too.
Yeah, they suspended the one from Arizona.
Yeah.
She was in the FBI because she contacted the CIA.
Yeah. Yeah.
They've been looking at people hijacking planes and stuff.
Oh yeah. So I mean, in a sense, it was bad intelligence, but on the other hand, it's political, right? I mean, if you don't tell them what they want to hear, then you're a troublemaker, right? And Pearl Harbor, to some extent, was that. But I mean, they botched it. They just botched it. But the point was, prior to Pearl Harbor, where there's this myth that FDR was trying to get into the war and using Pearl Harbor as an excuse, he already was doing that in Europe. He had destroyer for bases. He had Lend-Lease. He had selective service. And then this undeclared war, where the United States and the Germans are actually attacking each other in the Atlantic on the sea. So Roosevelt had the means to get involved in war, and I think it's pretty clear he was going in that direction. He didn't need Pearl Harbor. I mean, he could have done it against Germany, and Germany was a far more viable enemy as well, right? So, you already see that happening by the late 1940s. So, and Roosevelt is planning for it as well. I'm kind of jotting all over the place right here. A couple things go on. One I'll talk about later. In June of 1941, the war takes a major turn. What happens then? Operation Barbarossa. Germany invades the Soviet Union. Right? That's major because it brings the USSR into the war on the same side as the Americans and the British. I'll deal with that later. Okay, so that's a major development, and that's going to have a huge impact on the war. All right. As a result of that, a month later, Roosevelt and Churchill get together in Newfoundland, where they come up with something called the Atlantic Charter. All right, and this is the first conference between Roosevelt and Churchill, and they're going to meet a lot during the war. In Newfoundland, this is where Roosevelt promises to convoy. I know I'm all over the place chronologically. I told you that ahead of time. Don't sweat it. The big issues, I think, come out. Roosevelt promises these naval convoys at Newfoundland, but the big result of the conference at Newfoundland was something called the Atlantic Charter. And the Atlantic Charter reaffirmed the ideas of collective security and, like Lend-Lease, reaffirmed the open door. So again, Roosevelt is using the war, as he did with Lend-Lease, now in the Atlantic Charter, as a way to do what? To break up the British imperial preference system. That keeps coming in. So on one hand, this is a war because the Germans are really brutal and aggressive. That's all true. But what is the main goal? Who is Roosevelt actually acting against initially? The British. And relations between the Americans and British are quite testy during the war because of this. The U.S. is going to use World War II to end British colonialism. That's important.
I was just wondering, open door system with global conversation.
Yeah.
Did Churchill really understand that it was a British Empire?
Yeah, he did everything he could to hold on. But he knew that was what America's goal was, and probably was smart enough to realize that, yeah, it was numbered, right? But yeah, I mean, he clearly understood that. I mean, the Americans were not subtle, you know. In fact, in the Atlantic Charter, the U.S. initially pressed for a statement which would explicitly have endorsed free trade, meaning that it would have said empire is wrong. The British balked at that, and the Americans were quite upset by that. So they were not subtle at all. They were quite clear that they were going to use and again, what's America's power? It's economics, right? They're going to use this to get to extract, you know. I mean, this isn't the Boy Scouts. This isn't charity work. This isn't community service. We're not going to go fight against the Germans just because the U.S. doesn't feel like it's under any threat. There's actually a lot of revisionist arguments which suggest that the U.S. never had to get involved in World War II. That in fact, by the time the U.S. got involved in World War II, the British had subdued Germany. The Battle of Britain had failed, and that there probably would have been a longer deadlock, but that Germany was not going to take over. Germany wasn't going to succeed. And so the U.S. didn't have to get in. I don't know, I actually don't necessarily buy that. But the point is, there is that kind of line of thinking. So, why is the U.S. doing this? Why is it doing it? It's doing it because it has a bigger agenda, the bigger agenda being global open door, globalization. It's going to use what power it has, which is economic, in things like the Lend-Lease Act or in the Atlantic Charter to get at that. All right? So that's really, important. In fact, Roosevelt in 1941 tells Churchill that he's ready to go to war, and he says, "I'll wage war, but I would not declare it, and that I will be more and more provocative. If the Germans do not like it, then they can attack American forces." So this is kind of like, remember what Lincoln does at Appomattox, basically making the other side fire the first shot. This is what Roosevelt's goal is too. And he's not talking about Japan, he's talking about Germany. And this is when you get the attacks on the Kearny and the Reuben James. In fact, when the Kearny is sunk in October of 1941, Roosevelt says, "The shooting has started and history has recorded who fired the first shot." So, I mean, not to belabor the point, but clearly then, the United States is on a clear path toward warfare by late 41, prior to Pearl Harbor. Europe, in the meantime, is inflamed, although the Nazis have been stymied in the West. In the Battle of Britain, they have invaded the Soviet Union in the East, and that's about to blow. Yeah.
I thought that Germany did want to get involved or didn't want the U.S. to get involved. So why would they attack these ships? Isn't that who attacked them?
Yeah. Well, these are British. Yeah. But at the same time, I mean, what do? Just let them go on, unopposed? I mean, this is war. It's basically it's an undeclared war, but it's basically war. You can't let them go on unopposed, right? You can't pretend they don't exist. So yeah. All right. The legend of isolationism. I kept telling you how the U.S. was isolationist in the 30s, and it had neutrality laws, and it sat back and it didn't do anything. We talked, remember last week, about when Japan invades China and the U.S. doesn't do anything. All right. Well, there's clearly proof. There's clearly evidence to suggest that there is an isolationist tendency. The U.S. does not join the League of Nations. It rejects collective security. They thought that there was that those kinds of things could weaken the U.S. At the same time, however, the U.S. was never isolationist. All right, even though it has laws on the books that say we're not going to fight wars in Europe and we're not going to support these things, it clearly takes measures, like Lend-Lease that aren't. But even more than that, there remains a consensus throughout the 20s and 30s to extend America's economic and political interest everywhere. All right, and in the 1920s, you see a real maturation, a real coming of age of the open door policy. And Herbert Hoover, in a sense, picks up on the work of people like Hay, who created the open door notes, and especially Wilson. And so Hoover, too, has this vision of an open door world. All right? The Americans, Hoover and others, but especially Herbert Hoover is really a pivotal figure. Hoover has a really horrible historical reputation because he was president during the Depression. And in large measure, it's unfair. He was an incredibly bright guy, a very brilliant man. I think he was a chemist, by trade. He was an engineer, right? Who worked in mining and chemistry, who had his own company. He was a millionaire, I believe, many times over, and he understood the world. He was also a liberal. Hoover believed that harmony and stability were more important. So while others, remember that quote, Josephus Daniel said, the businessmen would rather have Diaz. Well, Hoover understands that. Hoover understands that left to their own devices, these businessmen will continue to operate that way. They'll work with strong men, they'll send the National Guard out to crush strikes and things like that. Hoover, my favorite Hoover saying was, the problem with capitalism is the capitalists. They're just too damn greedy. So Hoover believes in this. He believes in an open door world. He believes that the Americans can use the open door, can use economic power, can use democracy, commercial freedom, as a way to create prosperity and peace. That's important. You can't have revolution and you can't have war, because those are bad for stability and for business. So people like Wilson and Herbert Hoover believe that the open door is the road away from revolution, the road away from war. It was a way to preserve liberalism for the globe, for everybody. So Hoover was a Wilsonian, very much a Wilsonian. He believed that sound economics would bring political stability. Hoover was an economic determinist in a lot of ways. He believed that the root of this kind of global prosperity and global stability and peace was in a global economic stability as well. Hoover believed that you needed to control, just like Wilson, control the challenges of revolution. And you could see that in Wilson, in China, in Russia, in Mexico, in Hungary after World War I. There's actually a Bolshevik revolution in Hungary. A communist named Bela Kun comes to power, and he's overthrown within a year. In addition to that, Hoover wants to forge stable economic relations with the pariah countries, with the Germans, the Italians, and the Japanese. So they all believe that, and they also believe, importantly, that overseas economic expansion is the cornerstone of this prosperity and peace. So the interwar years, even though they're generally referred to as a period of isolationism, were actually a time of great expansion in America's involvement in global economy and intervention by American capital. There is, and the phrase, the legend of isolationism comes from a very well-known American historian named William Appleman Williams, right? So in the 20s and 30s, at this time when America is allegedly isolationist, there's a great movement to get engaged in the world. Charles Evans Hughes, who was the Secretary of State in 1924, said, "We are seeking to establish a Pax Americana," and a peace directed by the United States, maintained not by arms, but by mutual respect and goodwill and the tranquilizing processes of reason. All right, again, and these are kind of the buzzwords one uses for international commercial discourse. John Foster Dulles, later he would be Secretary of State, says in 1928, "We must finance our exports by loaning foreigners the wherewithal to pay for them. Without such loans, we would have the spectacle of our neighbors famishing for goods which were rotting on our warehouses as unusable surplus." Okay? Dulles is talking about surplus production and surplus capital. What do you do with that? You loan money to other countries. What do they do with that money? They purchase back the goods that you have made. This is a way to increase. Now that's, this is the legend of isolationism. At the same time, the U.S. is allegedly isolationist, doing everything it can to try to get more involved in the world commercially. Herbert Hoover in 1928 said, "We must find a profitable market for our surpluses." All right? Calvin Coolidge in 1928 says, "Our investments and trade relations are such that it is almost impossible to conceive of any conflict anywhere on earth which would not affect us injuriously." Henry Stimson, Secretary of State, Secretary of War, said, "The present is a time of great unrest and disquiet throughout the world, and it is in the interest of all governments to try to maintain order and stability." These are not the words of isolation. And in fact, direct overseas investment jumps. Between 1919 and 1929, it goes up over sixfold. So while the U.S. is allegedly lamenting what had happened in World War I and becoming isolationist, it is in fact becoming more deeply involved in global economy all the time. Ford, General Motors, IBM, AT&T, American Telephone and Telegraph, all invested heavily in Europe and in the industrial countries. Oil and mining interest focused on the so-called, what would later be called the Third World, the Middle East, Latin America, and Asia. So the Middle East, Latin America, and Asia will be the place where you get raw materials. Later on, scholars will come up with something called Dependency Theory. Anybody ever heard of Dependency Theory? It basically says that you have a core of nations, major industrial powers, and a periphery. The core uses the periphery for raw materials, for cheap labor. This is essentially what we see happening here. The major corporations, the GMs and IBMs, are going into the industrialized world, the already developed world, and operating with them, providing commercial intercourse on a more or less equal basis in finished goods, right? Or in services like, you know, IBM or AT&T. But the oil interest, the mining interest, the raw materials interest, where are they operating? They're operating in the third world. They're going into the Middle East for oil, of course, Latin America, Asia, and they're getting tin and tungsten and rubber and lumber and goods like that. That's the periphery. Okay? So you can see that in the 30s, and it's very prevalent, and the numbers are quite large already. By 1930 or so, at the start of the Great Depression, the government saw a need to increase global commerce, so they began to make what was called federal credit available to corporations to get them, as the government said, the capital necessary for overseas operations. So the federal government is beginning to subsidize global trade. Now, this is the same federal government that is reluctant to start a jobs program during the Depression. Remember, Hoover said, oh, we can't have jobs programs because it'll bust the budget. They are going to make federal credits available for businesses to promote global trade, which actually is a good idea. I mean, that actually would help the Depression by creating economic activity. There's no doubt about that. But at the same time, he's refusing to use that same federal money on works projects or unemployment at home, except, you know, in very limited ways. So you can kind of see the way these guys think, that, you know, kind of global welfare for corporations is more important than actually jobs or handouts or soup kitchens for the poor. So you start to see this government attempt to subsidize, you know, trade. At the same time, you see the emergence of finance capital. I don't want to get into this too much, although I think it's very important. Prior to this time, when we think of capitalism, we think of industry, right? In the late 19th century, you have the railroads. In the earlier 20th century, what's the most important economic sector? The most important product? In the 20s? Oil? Close. It's automobiles, cars. All right? Cars, industry. Cars dominate the economy in the 20s. That's why there's an economic boom in the 20s, because of cars, which use all the things you mentioned. Oil, glass, steel, rubber, you name it. All right? But by the 20s, basically, America has established the production capacity that it needs. And it enters what's called a post-industrial era. At that point, the bankers, finance capital actually becomes more important than industrial capital. Now, bankers have to find places to invest their money. So, I mean, the other companies still have to find places to sell their goods. There's no doubt about that. But at the same time, finance capital becomes important. We have to find outlets for this. Now, this is a problem in the 30s, because what's happening in the 30s with regard to global trade, I had that map up last week, there's a massive contraction, right? It goes down like to less than a third of what it had been, 1929 to 33. So there's a depression, and there's this massive contraction of world trade. And this is going to stifle efforts to move ahead. Nonetheless, in the so-called isolationist period, Americans recognized that that's going to be the answer, the global open door. In 1935, Franklin Roosevelt, in 1935, depression's in wicked bad shape, and 35 says, foreign markets must be regained if America's producers are to rebuild a full and enduring domestic prosperity for our people. There is no other way we would avoid painful economic dislocations, social readjustments, and unemployment. We need to find foreign markets. This is what Roosevelt's saying. In 1933, as a result of that, what had the U.S. done? In 1933, one of Roosevelt's first acts was to recognize the Soviet Union. Remember when the Bolsheviks took over in 1917? The U.S. never recognized the Bolsheviks. So between 1917 and 1933, for 16 years, essentially the U.S. was pretending that there was nothing there, even though there's this vast tract of zillions of acres, right? I mean, the U.S. in reality negotiated with them. And Henry Ford actually was trying to set up an auto plant in Siberia. But the U.S. did not recognize the Soviet. Finally, it does in 1933. In large measure, who was behind the recognition of the Soviet Union? It was American businessmen. Why? Because they thought the Soviet Union might become a big export market. big place. They maybe can buy our stuff. So that's one measure in this period of isolationism to try to promote global trade. In 1934, the Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, created a program called the Reciprocal Trade Program. Very simply, the United States and other countries would join together and agree to lower tariffs and lower duties. So, basically reciprocal trade means you lower your tariffs, I'll lower mine, we trade together, right? It also gives you unrestricted most favored nation status. You know what most favored nation is? It's still around today. If I give you a deal where I give you like no tariffs, right, then I give you the same deal. So if you have 0 tariffs, then I give you 0 tariffs. And if you have a deal with him to get 0 tariffs, then I give you the same deal. It's most favored nation, basically. So Hull is basically doing this reciprocal trade program, this reciprocal tariff, and with no tariffs, as a way to promote trade. So what's the idea? Yeah, we're isolationists, means we don't want to fight a war in Europe, but we want to become as engaged as possible in the world to create this global open door. To people like Roosevelt and Cordell Hull, free trade was nothing less than essential, utterly essential for a democratic political economy. They got it. These guys were liberals. They were Wilsonians. They were like Wilson and Hoover. They come out of that, like Keynes. All right? One diplomat, an American named George Messersmith, said that any other approach besides free trade, besides the open door, would call for a complete rearrangement of the entire economic setup of the United States. And in the 30s, what would that rearrangement be? What do you think he's referring to? Who was doing it differently in the 30s? Hitler and Stalin isn't really concerned. Socialism is not an issue in the U.S. I mean, no, the U.S. is never going to become socialist. And, Stalin, which is something of an economic miracle in the Soviet Union, no one really recognizes that as a viable economic system. Fascism is much different because fascism is very compatible with capitalism, right? It's basically statist capitalism. So when Messersmith says we either do it this way or we rearrange the system, what he's saying is we are going to have to become fascist. Fascist economies don't bother the U.S. And in fact, in the New Deal, Roosevelt will create stuff that looks similar to that. What bothers the U.S. about fascism is that it is an authoritarian political structure, and ultimately that's bad. That ultimately, deprives people of their democracy and their commercial liberty. So that's the real threat. But the type of corporative political economic arrangements that Mussolini and Hitler come up with are okay. And if you look at the New Deal, things like the National Recovery Act, the National Industrial Recovery Act, and the National Recovery Administration, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, those are very much corporatist arrangements where Roosevelt brings businesses in to work with the state in order to regulate the economy, to create codes, to limit production, to limit prices, to set quotas, and things like that. This is very much economically similar to what they're doing. So what Messersmith is saying is we can do that. We can have that kind of a limited, constricted system, but we're going to have to lose our way of life. We're going to have to lose our economic liberties. We're going to have to lose, our political freedoms. And if you do that, ultimately that will affect your consumptive capacity as well. So that's a real problem there, and that's what Messersmith's talking about. So basically, it's open door or die. And that may seem a bit extreme and a bit hyperbolic, but in a sense, that's what they're dealing with. Open door or change it all. Open door or we're in big trouble. So trade expansion, the search for an open door, defines the nature of international politics, of international conflict. Okay? An Assistant Secretary of State, a man named Francis Sayer, said that the United States, with its economic power, with its economic wealth, was up against, this is his quote, up against the current disastrous movement toward economic nationalism. That's what I was just referring to, right? Economic nationalism. This is what Messersmith was referring to. Economic nationalism, meaning Germany and Italy, taking over areas, using their raw materials. This is like old styles. It's almost like old school colonialism, right? Closed systems. It's kind of a mercantilist political economy, but corporative in the sense that these companies, these big corporations at home in the state work together, and we've gone over this to some degree already. So this is what the U.S. has to avoid. This is what the open door will avoid. It will not have economic nationalism. It will not have these new arrangements. It will have democracy, meaning commercial liberty, along with free trade. By the early 1930s, prior to prior to any aggression then by Germany, Japan, or Italy, by the early 30s, prior to any aggression, the United States had already deemed them the greatest dangers to the well-being of the U.S. Why was that? Before Hitler had invaded any other country, before the Italians had invaded Ethiopia, before Japan had gone into China, the U.S. had deemed those three countries as the biggest threats to global stability, to American wealth. Why? They were autarkic. They were economically nationalist. They were closing the door. So the United States had pinpointed those three as the enemy before any aggression. I'm not trying to make light of what they did, their aggressive tendencies, but that wasn't the real signal that they were dangerous at first. It was the fact that they were closing the door. So what does the New Deal do? What does Roosevelt do? Well, the answer is there. He attempts to find foreign markets, recognize the Soviet Union, reciprocal trade, send American bankers and investors out all over the world. In the third world, in the underdeveloped world, they're not using the phrase third world yet, the U.S. deepens the pattern of free trade imperialism. The good neighbor policy, which we talked about at the beginning, right? What the good neighbor policy does is send money in, money doctors in, but it also sustains the dependent status of those countries, right? I mean, does Haiti, does the Dominican Republic, does Cuba, does Nicaragua, does El Salvador actually develop? Do they modernize? No. Under the good neighbor policy? No. Not at all. What happens? American capital becomes more powerful in those nations, right? So this is free trade imperialism, and this is what Roosevelt and others want to maintain, and this is what the Germans and the Italians and the Japanese threaten. In 1940, Fortune magazine writes about this, and it says, the United States economy has never proved that it can operate without the periodic injection of new and real wealth. The whole frontier saga indeed centered around this economic imperative. Now, you want to talk about economic determinism that would make a Marxist blush. This is Fortune magazine saying that the United States has never proved it can operate, that it can survive without a periodic injection of new and real wealth, meaning open door, markets, trade. All right? So this becomes essential. All right? The alternative to economic nationalism. As a result, Fortune magazine says the U.S. needs a huge expansion of foreign trade and foreign investment. We have to find new places to buy stuff, to sell stuff, new places to invest. Cordell Hull's trade program, reciprocal trade, was a good first step, but, Fortune magazine says, to open up real frontiers under a general policy of raising the standard of living of other countries, we shall have to go much further. It's just a start. We need a global open door. Now, does Article 7 of Lend-Lease make more sense? Is Lend-Lease simply a way to bail out the British because they're having a tough time? Yeah, but actually Lend-Lease takes place after Germany's defeat in the Battle of Britain. Later on, in 1948, after the war was over, Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State, said, yes, war did come, despite the trade agreements. But it is a fact that war did not break out between the United States and any country with which we had been able to negotiate a trade agreement. It is also a fact that, with very few exceptions, the countries with which we signed trade agreements joined together in resisting the Axis. Cordell Hull concluded, the political lineup followed the economic lineup. All right? So was the U.S. an isolationist power? Was it an isolationist nation in the 30s? It stayed out of the war. It had neutrality laws, but it was deeply engaged. And in a sense, probably involvement in a war against the Axis was unavoidable. Why was that? Was it because they were doing such terrible things? Was it because of the treatment of Jews or the treatment of the Chinese in the rape of Nanking? Maybe. Maybe, but I think it's far more likely that these countries threatened the overall conception, the global conception that American leaders had had, from Woodrow Wilson through Herbert Hoover into FDR and Hull. All right? So this idea is really critical. Trade brings peace. The lack of trade brings war. It may seem simplified, but what did Cordell Hull say? In the end, the political lineup followed the economic lineup. country. There's a few years ago there was a book which what we called it the McDonald's theory, basically saying countries that have McDonald's never go to war against each other. I suspect that's probably not true anymore, but you get the point. This idea that commercial intercourse brings prosperity and peace with it, right? I'd hope to be much further beyond this. What I want to do with the war is go through this very quickly. The war brings out global goals, which I just talked about. The U.S. sees the war as an opportunity to extend the open door. And we see this both in the Lend-Lease Agreement and the Atlantic Charter. Both of those contained provisions unequivocally saying that free trade was crucial. And who were they directed at? They were directed at the British. Keep that in mind too. I mean, clearly Germany and Japan and Italy, to a lesser extent, just say Germany and Japan are the real enemies. But they will be dealt with forcefully, right, because there's a war going on. But these agreements are also directed, very importantly, against the British Empire, against the British imperial preference system. So Lend-Lease says, yeah, we're going to give you Lend-Lease supplies. And by the end of the war, the U.S. gives Britain something like $30 billion worth of Lend-Lease supplies. Gets some back and doesn't get all of it back. But as a result of that, we're going to help you, but you're going to open up your markets to us. You're going to let us in to your colonial system so we can get raw materials, we can invest, we can get trade there. That's a big deal. Atlantic Charter says the same thing. We will endorse a world based on free trade. The British don't believe in that. All right? I mean, British imperialism isn't open-door capitalism. Clearly, German fascism isn't either, but nor is British imperialism, nor is French imperialism. So all of these countries are basically violating the vision that Wilson and Hoover and Roosevelt have created, which is an open door world. Peace, prosperity, no revolution, no war, all come together. The U.S. also uses World War II as a means for industrial revival. We talked about Hitler earlier. The same thing happens in the U.S. Ultimately, World War II ends the Depression. Roosevelt, prior to that time, had tried various things. Some worked, some didn't. But beginning in the late 30s, when the war in Europe really starts to heat up, the Americans, pledging to become the arsenal of democracy, begin an industrial revival. Factories reopen. They run 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week. People go back to work. There's a draft eventually, which means that I think 16 million men will be in uniform. Since so many men are in the Army, who's going to work in the factories? Women and who else normally wouldn't have? No, not children. Blacks especially. Southern blacks. This is a great migration too. Depression War II. Blacks from the South, who generally had been involved in agriculture, moved to the North. And so you start to see the development of an urban black population and factory work. They get involved in politics. I mean, this is also kind of one of the reasons for the civil rights movement too. So you see this industrial revival along with these global goals, which means the U.S. is ready to go. I mean, they are ready to step out and become the global power unlike anybody has ever seen as a result of World War II. And the first step in that is going to be defeating Hitler, and that will commence, in late 41, early 42. Right, and we'll pick this up next time.